Hello and welcome to episode 2 of our lecture on ecosystems and human well-being. So in episode 2, we're going to talk about a very important ecological concept closely associated to ecosystem services. This lecture 2, as we first in episode 1 discussed ecosystem services, we gave a definition of ecosystem services. We try to show the relationship between ecosystem services and human well-being, as well as we shown some attempts made by economists to evaluate ecosystem services. In episode 2, we cover the subject of ecological integrity. And as always, we're going to finish this lecture with an interview in which we will have an opportunity to clarify some of the concepts discussed in the lecture. I hope that from episode 2 you will understand which are the current threats to ecosystem services, as well as the concept of ecological integrity in its relationship to ecosystem services. And I will finalize this episode 2 and the lecture itself with a brief description of attributes of ecological integrity. So again, threats to ecosystem services, following up by a definition of ecological integrity, and finish the episode with a conclusion. So, as we saw from episode 1, ecosystem services are so fundamental to life that they are easy to take for granted and so large in scale. If you think of the large ecosystems that cover the land surface, that it's hard to imagine that human activities could actually destroy them. Nevertheless, many human activities disrupt, impair, or re-engineer ecosystems every day, including, for example, runoff pesticides, fertilizers, and animal waste, pollution of land, water, and air resources, introduction of non-native species, the destruction of wetlands, which is a frequent threat with the growth of urbanization, overgrazing on rangelands, soil erosion caused by the disturbance of land cover, and obviously the process of deforestation, which is a common threat to our magnificent rainforest. Of the 24 ecosystems services assessed by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, 15 of them, or 70%, were found to be under stress. Now, environmental stress that can be detrimental to ecosystem services refers to physical, chemical, and biological constraints on the productivity of species and the development of ecosystems. When stressors increase or decrease in intensity, they elicit some type of ecological response. Stressors can be natural environmental factors, for example, climate change, or they can be associated with human activities, for example, fires or conversion of forest to croplands or conversion of forest to rangelands, urbanization, etc. Some environmental stressors are relatively local, for example, land use change, and they influence, while others are regional or global in scope, for example, climate change or global warming. Species and ecosystems have some capacity, though, to tolerate environmental changes and in the intensity of the environmental stressors, an attribute which is known by ecologists as resilience. However, there are limits to resilience, which represent what is called thresholds of tolerance. When these thresholds are exceeded, substantial ecological changes might occur in response to future increases in the intensity of an environmental stressor. Here are some examples of environmental stressors. Wildfire, for example, is a disturbance during which much of the biomass of an ecosystem combusts and the dominant species may be killed. Another current threat to ecosystem health is called pollution. The pollution corresponds to the occurrence, is related to the occurrence of chemicals in concentration large enough to affect organisms and thereby cause ecological change. Toxic pollution can be caused by gases such as sulfur dioxide and elements such as mercury and arsenic in the environment, and also pesticides and fertilizers from croplands. We mentioned here in our lecture on the planetary boundaries that phosphate and nitrate, one of the boundaries which have been already exceeded. So nutrients such as phosphate and nitrate can actually distort the ecological processes such as productivity, causing a type of pollution known as eutrophication, which is illustrated in the figure on the left. So eutrophication happens when excessive amounts of phosphate and nitrate reach the water. So particulates form at the surface and they block the entrance of sunlight. With the blockage of sunlight, some aquatic plants start dying. And as aquatic plants die, they decompose, and then there is a natural deficiency in oxygen, which also start causing the death of fish. Another large-scale environmental stressor is climate. Climate stress is caused by excessive or insufficient regimes of temperature, moisture, solar radiation, or combination of these two. If we look at ecosystems such as tundra and deserts, they are climatically stressed ecosystems, while, for instance, tropical rainforests occur in place with relatively benign climate conditions. Another important environmental stressor is what we call biological stress. Biological stress is associated with the complex interaction among organisms of the same or different species. Things such as competition, predation, parasitism, and disease all can cause biological stress. So it's important to note here that the harvesting and management of species and ecosystem, for example, by humans, is also a type of biological stress. This figure here on the left tries to show the relationship between all these different types of stressors and the impact on ecosystem services and human well-being. So the picture is very clear, but what we try to show here is that, for example, global change such as climate, change in biochemical cycles, change in land use, they all can affect biodiversity, which in its turn is also affected by changing the ecosystem caused by things like land use change, which is directly associated with human impact. An alteration, a disturbance in the biodiversity will affect ecosystem services and also will cause some type of a species introduction, maybe invasive, and cause also even death of species. And by it itself will result in some impacts in human well-being. So this brings us to an important concept, ecological concept, which has more or less been introduced more recently, and is called ecological integrity. So ecological integrity is the condition in which the ecological processes and biological communities of a given ecosystem function in a relatively self-sustaining equilibrium. According to Laura Wester, who is a renowned scientist devoting her research and studies to ecological integrity, ecosystems with ecological integrity exhibit an autopoietic, is a word that means self-creative capacity of life to organize, regenerate, reproduce, sustain, adapt, develop, and evolve over time at a specific location. So a system that exhibits all these capacities is considered to have ecological integrity. So I don't have much to say. I'll try to convince you that currently human activity has reached such a scope that it presents a real challenge to ecological integrity all over the globe, and therefore to ecosystem services upon which we depend for survival. The notion of ecological integrity is in some way analogous to that of human health. However, the metaphor of human and ecosystem health may not be perfect in some important aspects. For instance, health refers to individual organisms, while ecosystem contexts are much more complex, involving many individuals of numerous species and both living and non-living attributes of ecosystems. Ecological integrity is closely related to three important aspects of ecosystems: resilience, biodiversity, and ecosystem structure and function. When, for some reason, perhaps due to environmental stresses associated with humans or not, affect some of these characteristics, so the integrity of the ecosystem are affected. I would like to briefly talk about them, and we would start with resilience. Resilience has become such an important concept in ecosystem management that deserve our attention here a little bit. Scientists have found that ecosystems with great ecological integrity are, in a relative sense, more resilient or resistant to disturbances. In the ecological context, resilience refers to the capacity of a system to tolerate increases in stress without exhibiting significant responses. This is very important. As I mentioned, systems can change dramatically when subject to stresses, but as long as they are resilient, they can cope with the stress without going to dramatic changes. The greater the resilience of an ecosystem, the greater its ability to buffer disturbance and adapt to change. Natural systems are inherently resilient, but just as their capacity to cope with disturbance can be degraded, so can it be enhanced. Therefore, this has important implications for management. Ecosystem management can destroy or build resilience depending on how the ecosystem organizes itself in response to management actions. So I will demonstrate in our last lecture in civic ecology that one of the goals of civic ecology practice is to promote management activities that build resilience, as opposed to management activities that can destroy or undermine resilience. The loss of ecosystem resilience can trigger abrupt response, including shift to a qualitatively different, undesirable state when subject to even a small perturbation. This is a very, very important concept. To facilitate your understanding of resilience, I would like for for a moment to establish make an analogy of resilience, the resilience of a natural system with our immune system. So I think you can have a better understanding of what resilience means to natural systems by understanding the role of immunity in our immunity system. For example, if you have a healthy lifestyle, there's the tendency that you have a strong immune system. Therefore, you in your daily activities may be confronted with can find yourself in situations in which you probably could get sick, maybe a new bacteria, virus, or something, or someone sick that is just sitting on your side. However, without knowing, your immune system is strong enough to avoid you to get sick. However, if you don't have a healthy lifestyle, you can undermine your immune system, which would be the case, for example, of natural ecosystem when subjected to poor management or poor human interventions, which would debilitate the resilience of the system. As your immune system declines, now you can become sick when even subject to a small perturbation that would never be a problem for you. So I hope that this analogy between resilience and our natural immune system would help you to understand this important ecology concept. Pollution, climate change, loss of biodiversity, the altered freshwater flows caused by damming the rivers or diverting the water, they all can cause a loss of resilience and, as a consequence, a loss of ecological integrity. Biodiversity refers to the total richness of biological variation, including things like genetic variation within population and species, the number of species, and the patterns and dynamics of these over large areas. Biodiversity, which is nothing else than the degree of variety within an ecosystem, is key to resilience. For example, the graph on the left is showing you the result of some experiments in the Serengeti rangelands. It shows that more diverse grasslands recover faster. They are more resilient to overgrazing. The graph has this H' vegetation is an index of biodiversity, and you have an indirect measure of resilience on the left graph. So as you can see, there is an increase in resilience with an increase in diversity. And why is that so? Well, if you look at grasslands, a healthy grassland, for instance, we can find that several different species will commonly perform nitrogen fixation, a very, very important process in rangeland ecosystems. But each species may respond differently to climate events. So what that means is that the fact that each species respond differently to climate change will ensure that even though some species may be lost, may be very sensitive to the climate change, the process of nitrogen fixation won't be altered within the grassland ecosystem, because other species which are more tolerant to climatic fluctuation will be able to perform that function. So when we lose biodiversity, we lose species. And by losing a species, we lose that ability of having other species that can perform the same important process for ecosystem health when subject to climatic fluctuations. And therefore, less species, less possibility that the rangeland ecosystem, in this case, would survive to climate change or climatic fluctuation. And last but not least is another aspect that is also related to biodiversity and resilience. And this aspect is understood by ecologists as a structural and functional complexity. Structural relates to the form of the ecosystem, and functional relates to process. So structural and functional complexity of ecosystems is limited by environmental stresses associated with climate, soil, chemistry, and human activities. The figure here on the left is showing, for example, that ecosystem function and ecosystem structure is, in the absence of humans, is essentially controlled by the characteristics, geologic characteristics of the parent material and by climatic conditions. So now, land use change, which are usually associated with socioeconomic factors, can affect ecosystem function and ecosystem structure. So what we have now going on, and we mentioned this briefly when we discuss here planetary boundaries, is a combination of these two types of stressors. One is the possibility of global warming, climate change, and the other one is the tremendous pressure on land use change caused by human activity. So these two together can drastically affect ecosystem function and ecosystem structure, with impacts on their biodiversity, resilience, ecological integrity, and finally to vital ecosystem services to humanity. As the overall intensity of stress increases or decreases, structural and functional complexity will respond accordingly. Now, because of this close relationship and the interest of ecologists to understand the impacts of human activities on ecosystems, many studies have been conducted on the ecological responses of ecosystems to long-term disturbances. The commonly observed pattern of change in these studies are used to develop what they call environmental indicators. So, indicators are useful in determining whether an ecological condition is improving or being degraded over time in response to a certain environmental change, human or not human related. There are a huge number of environmental indicators in the literature, and ecologists continue develop these indicators. They vary widely in their scale, complexity, and intent. Sometimes relatively simple indicators can be used to integrate the ecological integrity of large and complex ecosystems. In the western United States, for example, the viability of population of spotted owls is considered to be an indicator of the integrity of the types of old-growth forest in which these endangered birds breeds. In conclusion, as human population grow, so the threats imposed on ecological integrity and the vital ecosystem services they provide to human and non-human life increases. Therefore, there is an urgent need to consider the long-term impacts of human activities on ecological integrity and the ecosystem services provided. Yet, the current efforts to develop and use the goods and services provided by ecosystems have not been well integrated with efforts, with action to protect them. I would suggest that you can continue looking at this important issue of the relationship between ecological integrity, resilience, biological diversity, ecosystem structure and function, and ecosystem services by investigating, exploring these three questions from episode number 2. First, why ecosystems with great ecological integrity are, in a relative sense, more resilient or resistant to disturbances? Or you could also formulate the question a different way. Why ecosystem with smaller ecological integrity or less ecological integrity are, in a relative sense, less resilient or less resistant to disturbance? Secondly, How does the loss of biodiversity affect ecosystem services? We look at the relationship between biodiversity and resilience, and we mentioned the close relation between resilience and ecological integrity, and the importance of ecological integrity to the maintenance of ecosystem services. And finally, what is the relationship between sustainable development, human health, and ecological integrity? Here I have a list of important references that would help you to further explore the concepts discussed in the lecture today. I would start by mentioning there is a very important classic reference by economist Daly and his associates on nature services, societal dependence on natural ecosystems. And of course, because the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment brought the notion of ecosystem services, it's very important for you to read at least volume 1 of the extensive body of literature that they developed, which deals specifically with ecosystems and human well-being, an assessment of the current state and trends. And Naim and others wrote a recent book that makes an attempt to relate biodiversity, ecosystem functioning, and human well-being from an ecological and economic perspective. And finally, I would like to mention two references related to Laura Westra, who has, as I mentioned, devoted great time of her life to doing research on ecological integrity. So there is a recent book they published, Laura Westra and her associates, on human health and ecological integrity. In that book, they discuss important issues associated with ethics, law, and human rights within the context of human health and ecological integrity. And finally, the ethics of ecological integrity and ecosystem health, again, a paper by Laura Westra, published in a book by Rapport and others called Managing for Healthy Ecosystems. I want to thank you for your attention in lecture number 3. And I hope that during our interview, you will have an opportunity for revisiting some of the concepts discussed in class. And also, I hope that at this point you start making the connection between civic ecology, which is a management human initiative at the local and regional level, and the global scale planetary boundaries that we discussed in the previous lecture. So the lecture today, I see this as a transition. Now, the notion of ecosystems and ecological integrity and ecosystem services is providing the bridge across the scale between the large scale global change, which we describe in terms of the 9 planetary boundaries, and the more regional or local scale ecosystems. See you during our interview in episode 3. Thank you very much.